Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pelican Brief Weekly. I'm Murray Rundus, very happy to be joined by our CEO, Brian McCall. How have you been, Brian?
I've been great. It's good to see you. It's hard to believe we're in the beginning of June. The Feast of the Sacred Heart is here already. It's really time is flying by. Part of that is there's a lot of stories going on.
Yeah, lots of stories going on. We have a good lineup this week, some tragic events, but also some interesting events that I think it's important to really get an understanding of. We're going to begin with this Spanish trip that Pope Leo has taken. It's an important trip on a number of different fronts. There's been some controversy associated with it. There's been some good things that Pope Leo has come out with, and then there's also been some not so good things that have come out of it. Some which has been sort of a trend with this papacy, is, as Chris Ferrara put in his latest article, it's been another mixed bag. Or our second story, what we're going to be talking about is something that's going on in the education system. Brian's going to tell us all about. And then the final story we're going to be talking about is this murder of a Catholic bishop in Africa. We'll let you know what the deal is there. We've been reporting on that recently. But Brian, before we move into the stories, could you tell us what is happening in the liturgical calendar, and what event do we have coming up for Pelican Plus, especially coming up?
Yes, we have the Feast of the Sacred Heart, which is to occur Friday, June 12th this year. It's a movable feast based from the calendar for Easter. It happens the Friday after the week of Corpus Christi. And it's really interesting. The Feast of the Sacred Heart is something that God gives to the church late in time. Although devotion to the Sacred Heart and the concept of the Sacred Heart goes all the way back to apostolic times, but the sort of way we think about it is revealed to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque in France, 100 years before the French Revolution. And it's God giving to the world the remedy that he knows that will be needed when the revolution breaks upon France and the world. As part of that, asks for the King of France to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. And the King of France delays, does not do it. And exactly 100 years later from that request, France is plunged into the revolution. Finally, really on the eve of his execution, Louis XVI, the last king before the revolution, the king who will be executed, consecrates his country to the Sacred Heart. And so the part of that devotion is not only the first Fridays, but encouraging consecration to the Sacred Heart. Then in the 20th century, there's a great movement coming out of South America from Father Mateo to consecrate families to the Sacred Heart, institutions. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, we got to give them credit when they do something good, are going to consecrate our country to the Sacred Heart on this feast. So at Pelican, one of the things I decided early on in stepping into the new role is that we needed to consecrate everything we're doing at Pelican to the Sacred Heart of our Lord Jesus Christ. So as announced in a video and on social, tomorrow after or during Mass, of the Sacred Heart, I will consecrate everything that we do on Pelican, the app, the platform, the videos, the ebooks, the audiobooks, the prayers, the chant, everything to our Lord's Sacred Heart. So I will be posting on social shortly, if it's not already there by the time you see this, a form of consecration, and encourage everyone who participates in this, our founders, club members, our Fleet and Holy League members, our subscribers, our collaborators, creators, to join me in reciting this consecration of Pelican Plus to the Sacred Heart. I adapted a prayer of St. Margaret Mary Alacoque of consecration to include all of these aspects of our apostolate. We're in a difficult position, starting up, just 6 months old, have a lot of challenges in front of us, but I think this consecration of the Sacred Heart will give us the supernatural aid we need to see this venture through.
Yeah, definitely. We've been very excited about this consecration. We want to really bring this apostolate forward with the Sacred Heart in mind. And we in this month where, of course, June is corrupted by the secular world, I think this should be a time of renewal for us to get back to really what is the basis of our faith, and really piercing the Sacred Heart for that. Another saint that a person on the liturgical calendar that we're looking at as well as St. Barnabas, whose feast is today as we're recording this. And St. Barnabas is one I think is very important for what we've been talking about on the platform recently, you can watch Tim Flanders' great roundtable, his dialogue that he had on Judaism and Catholicism. And what does that have to do with St. Barnabas? Well, St. Barnabas was one of the first members of the Catholic Church we can think of. He's traveling along, corresponding with Paul, but also as the cousin of Mark the Evangelist, and really just understanding that, I think, paints an interesting picture of what the church, the early church, is looking like. But he's also the great writer of what is known as the Epistle of Barnabas, which is not canonical. It's not in sacred scripture, but it's one of the if you're opening up the apostolic writings, like the first volume of what you might find in a collection of the church fathers, this writing is going to be at the beginning, right along with Justin Martyr and St. Ignatius of Antioch, because it's a very important moment in sacred scripture, in not sacred scripture, excuse me, but patrology, looking at the patristics, because of how they're looking at the new revelation that we've received from Jesus Christ. And the Epistle of Barnabas is very focused on Judaizing and the problems that it causes. So Christians that are not willing to take the plunge forward and saying, hey, we are in a new covenant where we have a new relationship that's purified, with its sending us back to the purity of in the beginning of Adam and Eve, what we're wanting God's purpose for us to be, what it was from in the beginning. And instead, a lot of these Judaizers were going back to the old law, the Old Testament, and trying to find a way to mix Jewish ritual practices with Christianity. You see this today in the Messianic Jew movement. And this is something the Epistle of Barnabas comes down very hard on, of saying we need to focus on the new covenant, and the great gift that Jesus Christ has given us. St. Barnabas is also a martyr. There's different accounts of how St. Barnabas was killed, whether it be being hung or being stoned. I believe there's another account that I can't remember off the top of my head. But no matter what it shows is that the first Christians, the first Catholics, were willing to die for their faith. They weren't wanting to simply get a place at the table and dialogue with the world. They were wanting to establish the faith of Jesus Christ, and were willing to die for it. And I think that martyr spirit, looking more towards the martyrs, looking more towards the first Catholics, is, I think, a great moment for us to reflect. We're going back to those origin points as we're talking about, going back and trying to renew in the month of June. We can look back to the first Catholics, the first Christians, and say, what was the spirit present there that we might not have present today, but we could use some of? So I think St. Barnabas, we ask for his intercession. Maybe take some time, read that. It's a pretty short work, the Epistle of Barnabas, in comparison to some other patristic writings. I think it's a great work.
Yes, it is. And we'll turn to our first story then. That the Pope, as you probably heard, is in Spain. And like most post-conciliar things, it's kind of an interesting mixed bag coming out of that trip. So you want to kick us off in talking about again, we can't cover all of the aspects of this trip, but some aspects of it.
Yeah, there's been a couple of things that stand out. You talk about the mixed bag. I think that is shown really in a perfect way with how a lot of the celebrations took place. In some places, you see sort of musical, as in like the musical productions, celebrations that were going on, with sort of odd theatrical things that I would say is not the the most Catholic thing in the world, but is certainly, it's a part of popular culture. You saw that mixed along with some very beautiful Corpus Christi processions. I was actually surprised. I was expecting it to sort of be ashamed in a sort of World Youth Day kind of way, but I actually thought a lot of the Corpus Christi processions that Pope Leo did were quite tastefully done. And the thing that I think was astounding is that over 1 million people attended these gatherings and went and saw the Pope there in Spain, which shows that the Catholic Church still does have a great deal of influence and power, even if just sort of a soft power over the people. It is still something that is amazing to behold. 1 million people went there and saw Pope Leo. there was another statement that was made in one of Pope Leo's speeches that I thought was interesting, which is that he took this opportunity to address the Spanish Parliament to bring up the dangers of euthanasia and abortion. That's something I was impressed with. Pope Leo, and that statement in of itself, the speech was sort of mixed in and of itself, but using that as an opportunity, using that as a sort of pulpit to speak on those issues when euthanasia is something that is widespread, being pushed, especially in Europe, especially in the UK, I'll say as well. We see a lot of that recently. That did take some strength, and that is something the Vicar of Christ should be talking about. That there is this danger of a lack of respect for life. There's a lack of purity in that sense of an understanding of the human body, of our understanding of our last ends as well. That's completely been lost in many parts of the Western world, and so I was happy about that. The other thing I want to mention is the controversy, and I think some of the good things surrounding his time in Barcelona with the La Sagrada Familia Cathedral or Basilica there that has been built. That has a rich history behind it. It's been over 100 years in the making. It's sort of like Cologne Cathedral in that way. It's taken a long time to build. There was this great architect who had, depending on how you view his architectural ideas, who had some um, ambitious projects for this cathedral, and it hasn't always gone in a perfect way. It's been a rocky road to build this cathedral or this basilica. It's a gigantic building. If you go and you see it, it's gigantic. If you even just see pictures, it's going to tower over the landscape. It's one of the biggest Christian buildings in the entire world. And the final piece of the tower, of the main structure itself, was consecrated by Pope Leo XIV. That's why he visited there to inaugurate this. Now, we talked about this with Michael Haynes on the Daily Show this morning, that it was in itself mixed. You had some ironic things, which you had a lot of use of AI and drone technology that was present in this celebration, with a drone show that was there. And in addition to that, you had the use of the cathedral was, I think it leaned more secular than religious. You had a lot of choral, sort of modern choral instrumental music, which was playing, which I did find quite tasteful and beautiful. But you also had a massive light show that was done. And what I couldn't help but remark on is that it was somewhat naturalistic, the celebration. It was a beautiful celebration, we can say that, but it's one that was it had very little to do with Jesus Christ. It had more to do with a cultural celebration of the natural world, or of what man builds, rather than using this as an actual consecration of a church. I remember seeing in St. Mary's, Kansas, the Immaculata being consecrated, and seeing the traditional form of that. And I saw that in person. And you could not mistake that this was being consecrated for a purpose above ourselves. And I think this is an interesting point for the cathedral itself. The cathedral has been very polarizing for some people. It's opened up this conversation in the Catholic world as to, is this good architecture? Is this bad architecture? Good art, bad art? Because there's all these different kinds of architecture and art being used in this cathedral. And I'll hopefully have some pictures up on the screen here so you can see it. All in some people, I think Edward Habsburg had a comment saying he doesn't find that it really inspires devotion. He doesn't like the architecture associated with it. This has been a conflict going back and forth. And what I remark is that it's very clear to me that the cathedral is a celebration of nature. It's a celebration of looking what the natural world is. And I think there's something theologically sound to that, and that God created nature, God created the environment, and so sort of emulating that and seeing these sculptures that are trying to maybe look like a rainforest inside, or the outside that looks like a rocky hill. That's interesting, but and that's something to contemplate on. But what should the Catholic Church be, and what should the art and architecture be? It should really try to bring us up to supernature, transcending above what is natural, transcending above what is possible through merely our means, and celebrating what we do through the works of man. But instead, we look to what can the works and the gifts of God bring to us. And that's something that is lost, I think, in some of this trip to Spain. There's been this emphasis on what can man do? What is the hope for man? When really there is this loss of emphasis on how can man sure, look at the good things that he has been given from a natural perspective, but transcend that and look to God. And I think whether it's La Sagrada Familia or the trip to Spain itself, or some of the speeches of Pope Leo XIV, or some aspects that Brian will mention as well, I think that's what stands out to me. There's been a loss of emphasis on God and bringing it back towards man, and this more human-centered, humanistic Catholic merger together that we've seen in the post-conciliar era and emphasized in the pontificate of Pope Leo XIV. But Brian, what did you make of this trip to Rome? Maybe you could give some comments on some of those other things and tell us the rest of the story.
Yeah, and I have to say, your remarks about the structure, I agree with. Now, I have to admit, it's been over 20 years since I've been to Barcelona, and I haven't seen the Sagrada Familia in person since then. But it was my impression that it was emphasizing nature, but in an unnatural way. It was interesting. It was like nature was present in Gothic cathedrals. You had different birds and animals and different decorations, ivy, but it always sort of looked natural and flowed. This almost felt artificially natural, was, again, my impression at least. Maybe it's different now. But I think you're right. It is a bit of an epitome for the whole trip, which had these beautiful supernatural moments like the Corpus Christi procession. But then just today, a report I read about Pope Leo's visit to the Canary Islands. And the Canary Islands is really a flashpoint for the illegal immigration issue, the invasion of Europe that's been going on, because tens of thousands of people pass through the Canary Islands making their way into Europe just past year, whereas just 10 or 11 years ago, and the actual figure is 46,843 in 2024, but 2015 there were less than 1,000. So this is a real flashpoint for this little invasion of Europe. And what does the Pope say? I just want to read from his speech that he made there. And he also met with NGOs and organizations that deal with migrants and human trafficking, which is a bad thing, human trafficking. We'll talk about the causes in a second. He, quote, made an appeal to the conscience of politicians that human dignity has no passport and does not lose its value when crossing a border. He warned of our growing custom to the Mediterranean and the Atlantic becoming unmarked graves. He said, "Dear migrants, before saying anything else to you, I want to bow before your dignity. You are not just numbers or files. You are people. You have left behind families and homes. You have dreams that no one has the right to despise." Now, first of all, it's bizarre. This is worthy of Pope Francis, bowing before the dignity of migrants. And it's odd. Catholics get accused of worshiping the saints and worshiping the Blessed Virgin Mary. People don't understand the proper distinctions between latria, dulia, hyperdulia. But this is only going to create confusion, right? What are we bowing before human dignity? Right? Not even venerating a saint, but bowing before the very concept of just humanity, of human being. It is really a bit animistic, pantheistic, that human dignity is worthy of respect because it is a creation of God. It is not something in and of itself, right, that is good. It is good because it comes from God. And this is really just a bizarre image, I think, and worthy of Pope Francis. But the underlying problem with this whole speech, and he lays a wreath because many immigrants have died. Many people have died trying to, go through the Mediterranean to get there and the North Atlantic. But what he doesn't address is the cause of this. Yes, there are people being trafficked, there are people dying, but it's because the global elites, those in charge, are encouraging this. They are causing it to happen through multiple means, not least of which all these wars in the Middle East and Africa, Libya, now in Iran, in Iraq and Afghanistan, to drive populations to move. They are encouraging them to come, to tell them we're going to let you in. And they are therefore subjecting these people to being trafficked, to being killed, to dying at sea. And instead of denouncing these, the elites, the oligarchs who are driving this population movement because they want to invade Europe, they want to change its culture, it's a war on Christendom, he just sort of acts like that doesn't happen, and just all these poor immigrants are just wandering here on their own. We have no idea why they're here, and we just have to accept them in. And it really is a shame, because he could be denouncing, as Leo XIII did, these horrible forces of oligarchy in our world that are causing this to happen. But instead, he's just denouncing the effects and not the cause. And then directing attention to the ever elusive human dignity at the center of Digitatis Humanae, the great problematic document at Vatican II. So again, this was really, people who want to say Leo XIV, a big break with Francis, restoring, this was very much a repetition of something Pope Francis would have done.
Yeah, the emphasis on man and this semi-worship of man is something that is a key part of understanding the post-conciliar period. I was reading a lot of John Paul II recently, and you see in him a lot. He speaks of the fact that simply because Jesus Christ has taken on a human nature, that this in some way, and this is a reference to Gaudium et Spes, sanctifies all of humanity and in a way almost divinizes it. There's a change in human nature itself because of the incarnation. And this is not something that you see explicitly in those terms in the preconciliar era as much, certainly not to that extent. And you see, this is taken to such an extent where I think there's an overly optimistic view of what human nature is. And it leads us to, I think, look past a lot of the problems that we have in our age that are in some ways you consider them unhuman, but in some ways they're perfectly human. And that there is this ravaging concupiscence and sinful tendency of mankind to tend towards evil. And this is oftentimes being ignored by the post-conciliar hierarchy because of the desire to worship the dignity of man. And it's certainly been a problem. But Brian, moving on from in our stories, maybe turning things away from the church and more towards the secular world, what do you have for us this week?
In a world of social media filled with noise, advertising, clickbait, lust, and anger, we decided to create something different. An all-in-one digital haven for serious Catholics made by fellow Catholics. A place where your love of beauty, reverence, tradition, holiness, and truth can be nourished and deepened. Here you will find resources for your daily routine, including traditional prayers for every need, rosaries in Latin and English, recited and sung, morning and evening devotions, Mass Ordo and Propers, the Divine Office, Butler's Lives of the Saints, the entire New Testament in the Douay Rheims version read aloud. Music, an extensive library of Gregorian chant, all the wonderful CDs of the Benedictines of Mary in Gower. Writing and news coverage, including Dr. Peter Kwasniewski's Tradition and Sanity, Vatican correspondent Michael Haynes, Murray Rundus and Brian McCall at the Pelican Brief, and more. An extensive library of ebooks, both popular and academic. The entire vault of the Mass of the Ages, a lifetime's worth of education in the traditional Latin Mass and all that goes with it. Pelican Plus Social is the place where we exchange notes, comments, and advice, ask one another questions, and share wisdom. And soon, we'll be launching Pelican University, which has the potential to massively expand the educational reach of the Catholic faith in all its truth and glory. With a membership in Pelican Plus, you're supporting a fully Catholic company producing fully Catholic content, both classic and cutting edge. Come and see what you're missing. Come and find what your family will love and profit from in time and eternity. Pelican Plus, where the faith flourishes, where your faith grows.
Yeah, this is an interesting and important story that the news media generally has not covered. I think I only saw one news outlet, the Epoch Times, cover this. And it was a report issued recently by a sort of education watchdog group, the Council for Quality and Teacher Preparation Programs. So they're reviewing not outcomes from our primary and secondary schools, but programs that prepare and teach teachers. It's sort of Plato would say, right? The guardians of the guardians, the teachers of the teachers are a critical role in what's going to happen to your society. And so they conducted a study of these programs, education degrees, NCTQ for short. It's called the Teacher Prep Review, Decoding Progress in Reading Preparation. So they focused on teaching reading. And sadly, although there were some improvements among some programs, roughly half of teacher preparation programs, 47%, fell short of preparing future teachers in 5 core components of the science of reading. So they got failing grades, 47%, in preparing teachers to teach reading. 1 in 5 programs were still using debunked reading methods, despite clear evidence that they actually don't work. They give little time and attention to preparing teachers to support struggling students, particularly with dyslexia, for example. And why do I think this is important? The Catholic Church is the guardian of education. She is who not only preserved knowledge and education from the ancient world, but established the school system we have today. She, through cathedral schools, eventually parish schools, monastic schools, developed the entire system of education. One of its key components was, first of all, hierarchy. All of the disciplines in the progress of education was hierarchically ordered. The end was theology, the mistress of all knowledge, but it started with key skills, the quadrivium, the trivium, grammar, for example. And the church understood, if you can't read, if you don't know grammar, the rules of the language, you can't study philosophy. You can't study these higher arts because you need these basic skills. And reading is a key one. And this is not an accident, in my opinion. They have been in an assault to, I think, eliminate literacy from our population, because a population that cannot read information is more easy to control. Now, why did this story catch my attention? Over 30 years ago, my wife was teaching in a diocesan Catholic school in Philadelphia, in a very poor neighborhood, really rough neighborhood. A couple of the mothers came to parent-teacher night dressed for work. And we won't comment on what that work is. It was pretty obvious what kind of work it was. It was not a very moral practice. But this is the kind of kids we're dealing with. Inner city school. And she was teaching second grade. Kids could not read. And they had all these expensive books that were bought with government money. And essentially the way they were taught to read was to memorize a couple short books so they could recite them, but they couldn't read them at all. They would just read these stories over and over again. Now, first of all, they were morally deficient. And she told me once, and this is before we found tradition, so we really didn't know our faith that well. She said she felt uncomfortable one day because she wrote up one of the sentences from the book called The Hot Hippo that they were supposed to read. And the sentence was, Ungi, this African god, is the god of everyone and everything. And I remember she sort of just looked up at the board and saw the crucifix. It was still in the classroom. She's like, this is kind of weird, she thought. Again, we didn't understand our faith as well, but something in her just thought, why are we reading this? Like, this is crazy. But more on the natural level, what got to her is these kids couldn't read. They could recite this Hot Hippo book, but if you gave them another book, they couldn't read a word. So literally, she smuggled into the school, because it was illegal. She was going to get in trouble from the principal, hooked on phonics, which was a phonics-based reading program. And again, these kids, there were a lot of base was all African-American. It uses a lot of music and rhythm to teach phonics and reinforce it. And they loved it. It appealed to their natural sense. By the end of the semester, they could all read, because she had to, whenever the principal and the priest would come in, she had to bring out the Hot Hippo books. And when they would leave, they put them away and get out the phonics books. And by the end of that year, all of these kids who couldn't read could read. And it started, she's like, why is this? Why would you create a program that doesn't work and ban phonics? And she said, like, within a few weeks, they were able to start reading at a basic level because they knew phonics, right? Now then, there's other parts of it, as the study shows. Phonics is only a part of it. There's other skills, but they weren't teaching any of them. It was just fake it through it. Other techniques they taught is look at the picture and figure out what it says from the picture. Well, that's only going to take you so far, right? You're going to get maybe a general concept, but you can then trick people, right, by putting a picture in that doesn't really represent what the words are. If they can't verify for themselves, you can just put things by them. So it really struck me because here we are, this was in the 1990s. So, over 30 years later, and we haven't learned anything. Over half, basically half of the teacher preparation schools are still pushing the equivalent of the hot hippo, and not teaching reading. And what does this mean? I mean, that's why do we have generations of people that, sit and watch YouTube videos for all their information, don't read at all. And honestly, it's not their fault. They can't, right? They haven't been given the basic educational skills to progress through the hierarchy of knowledge. And again, a lot of people, I've heard some traditional Catholics say, oh, it's a big deal. People were illiterate for centuries. And well, we lived in, first of all, a very different culture. A culture where, first of all, the church transmitted information orally and visually. Given the collapse of seminary training, that's not happening, right? Unless you go to a traditionalist chapel with a properly trained priest. And so we've lost all these other methods and means of the truth. And reading, the great strides in literacy that the world did make in the 19th century are the powers that be realize how dangerous it is, because you can go get your own information. You can verify things. The crisis in the church, remember, we didn't have the internet in the 70s and 80s. How did people find it? Through books like Tan Publishing, Catholic Treasures, people that put books out that got the truth out. That is how the traditionalist movement survived. So if you destroy that at the educational level, you can control population. So I think this is a frightening study that we're now really 2 generations into destroying people's ability to read, and nobody really seems to care about it.
Yeah, there's 2 things I want to comment on with this, which is the first is that this is why it's very important for traditional Catholic schools to be present. And this is why I think the Society of St. Pius X has recognized it as being a fundamentally core part of what they do, which is establishing schools across the world in using these traditional practices of learning, of education, not just religion, but in many places across the United States especially, you will find phonics is still being taught. You'll find that good literature is still being presented, and these ideals of what education should be and how children should be raised, not just to be cogs in a machine, but whole human persons. That's still very important, and that is why it's very important for the traditional religious orders to do that. And it's something I will say, even though it's present in the Ecclesia Dei communities, it's not as much as the Society of St. Pius X. And it's a gap in the traditional Catholic movement that I think needs to be recognized, is the lack of traditional schools serviced by the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Institute of Christ the King, all of these ecclesia or diocesan traditional Latin Mass priests, for example. This is something neglected in the conversation, but it's something very important. We cannot be a movement just based around the traditional Latin Mass, or even though we love, as tradition-loving Catholics, we love the traditions of the church. But if we're just saying, oh, we have our Mass, that's enough, can't be that. We're looking to become a whole human persons. And the Catholic schools, as they are in the diocesan structure, aren't cutting it in order to raise children, at least in the, I would say, many of the cases, in order to raise children with what they truly need to be good Catholics, but also just wholly formed human persons. The last thing I'll mention, though, is this is why it's important for a liberal arts education to be promoted in the traditional Catholic movement, but also just if you're a young guy trying to figure out how to get your life together, the first thing I would suggest is go get a liberal arts education at one of these great liberal arts institutions that are flourishing across the United States. And the reason for that is because the education system in higher level education in the university circuit, but also the lower schools, it no longer emphasizes how we can grow our cultural understanding, grow our in the sense of the virtues by reflecting on literature, but most importantly, being able to read and comprehend, to think in so many words, to in order to understand the world for ourselves. It's depriving us of our intellect. And Brian hinted at something. He said, look, this is something that is to gain more control over the masses. I think that's getting at something very true, which is the fact that in the modern world, the person with a liberal arts education is seen as a danger to the system, somebody who's actually able to think for himself, not just going to be manipulated by propaganda and mass media. This is the kind of person, as Catholics, we should be looking to promote, going back to that martyrdom mentality. If we're going to have that martyrdom mentality, getting back to the roots of what we are as Catholics, we have to be able to think for ourselves, use our intellects, and understand the truths of the faith using faith and reason. And for that, we need a liberal arts education.
And all right, warning, I'm getting a little controversial here. So go to your safe space because I'm going to bring up a controversial topic because you touched on schools. And that is homeschooling, right? So I think there's a danger we've fallen into in the traditionalist movement. I think I actually fell into it myself at one point, is to become a bit of a libertarian on this point, right? That, well, homeschooling and parents, and they can do it all, and we don't need schools. And they often point to Pius XI, who says parents are the primary educators of their children, which is true, but they ignore what else Pius XI said. And that is that the church has always taught that actually the church has rights over the child when it comes to education, that the parents need to cooperate with the church, that it isn't just this American Wild West, we can educate our own children, we don't need the church. And that controversial case of Pope Pius IX, where he actually took the Jewish child who was baptized against the parents' will in a problematic way, but said, now that he's baptized, we're going to take that child away and educate him, is an illustration of the principle that once the children are baptized, yes, the parents are the primary educators, but they're not meant to do that alone. They are meant to cooperate with the church. And the way the system is supposed to work is the church provides the school so that after the children are reared and given their foundation of education, they're handed to the church with the parents still cooperating, still supporting and participating, but the church needs to be part of that. And so the normal means is church-run schools. Now, as to homeschooling, we live in a crisis. So just like it's not normal to have mass in a Sheraton hotel ballroom, the schools have collapsed just like the churches. And so many people do find themselves in situations where they can't get to one of these very few good, solid Catholic schools, and they may have to homeschool. But what's the important, and I'm not criticizing that at all, it's heroic. But what's important about it is not to turn it into a principle, as I think some in the traditional movement tend to do. Like, this is the best way, this is the way God intended it, would be like saying having a mass in the Sheraton ballroom is the way God intended the church to work, and this is where it's normal, and we shouldn't be building churches, right? And it's also important that whenever we have to do something abnormal, when we have to supply because the church is in crisis, God will give us the grace to deal with it. So, when some people who were very far from a traditional mass said, priest, what can we do? We can't get to mass every Sunday. It's only once a month. We're not going to have the sacraments all the time. We're not going to be able to be saved. He said, no, God will give you the grace to deal with the circumstance that is presented to you, right? So if he gives you a trial, he will always give you the grace to deal with that trial. Where he won't give you the grace is if you go off and create the trial yourself, right? You don't just accept it from God and he says, here's your trial, here's your grace. You're like, I want to go do this thing. God's not directing you to it. Then he's not going to help you. So if you're sitting next to a good Catholic school that is running these principles, and you just say, well, I'm not putting my kids in it on principle because I'm a libertarian and I should raise my own children, God is not necessarily going to give you the grace to homeschool them well, because he is saying, here is what you should be doing. You're turning your back on it, right? Very different from someone in rural Wyoming, who there's obviously nothing there. God will give you the grace to homeschool and do the best for your children. But it's presumption to sort of think, I will reject what God gives me if you're available for you, and then expect him to give you the grace to deal with that normal situation. So, all right, everybody calm down. I probably stirred up some people with that, but a little controversy here and there is okay.
Definitely some controversy there, Brian. But this is a point that I think you'll hear, especially from traditional priests, because a lot of time goes at the very least. We can say this: there's a lot of work that goes into the traditional schools, and even though I think we should have a great deal of skepticism towards the public education system, I think looking towards these traditional schools and giving them a shot, if one is very skeptical, actually just saying, what do they have to provide? I can testify as somebody who's taught in those schools before. There's a lot of good that comes out of that. So, as Brian said, a lot of controversy associated with that topic, but I think people can see the clarity in your response. But before moving on to our last story, Brian, we have our cultural recommendations for this week. What do you have for us?
So I have a piece of music that I'd like to recommend from Mozart, and it's his setting of the Ave Verum Corpus. And I think it really, to me, epitomizes Mozart's religious compositions, because you can tell, if you're imbued with sort of the history of church music and the melodies and the rhythms, everything, that he was brilliant at taking the chant or taking existing structures of music and embellishing them and bringing beauty to them. You hear this in a lot of his masses, where you can hear the undertones of the chant being played upon in the polyphony. And I think the Ave Verum Corpus is really a beautiful example of that, his setting of it, where he's taking the chant of the particular setting that existed and really bringing his musical genius to it. There's a lot of recordings. Herbert von Karajan with the Berlin Philharmonic has a really beautiful recording of it, but there are others you can find. And being in this right now, the octave day of Corpus Christi, this month dedicated to the Sacred Heart, to the body, particularly of our Lord, it's a beautiful piece to listen to meditate upon that beautiful Ave Verum Corpus.
Yeah, when my wife and I got married, and we were asked, what kind of music do you want at the mass? Is there any special requests? I said, we have to have Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus. It's just an amazing piece of music, and we were glad to have it at our wedding too. The thing I wanted to suggest reading or watching this week, it's one that we've talked about a lot on this show and other shows here on the platform. It's just a cultural staple, but I really want to encourage people to read it. It's Shakespeare's Hamlet. Now, I'm working on a video that's talking about some things surrounding this. There was a recent conversation on the Daily Wire between Michael Knowles and Andrew Klavan about this piece of great literature from Shakespeare, and there's been a lot of controversy I've noticed surrounding that video they made, and I think it's important. There was a lot of controversy, especially around Michael Knowles' assertion that the work is about the Protestant Revolution and the modern world. And in light of talking about humanism and some of these things, I think Michael Knowles was absolutely right in making that assertion, that it is about the modern world and about the Protestant revolt. Shakespeare's Hamlet is about the modern world and about the Protestant revolt, because it's looking at Shakespeare as speaking as the first modern man, one foot in the modern world, one foot in the old world of Catholicism, of old Christendom. He's having to deal with a new society that is very introspective, looking at everything with a great deal of doubt, doubting everything. And Hamlet is really the personification of that, the character, doubting everything, trying to figure out, how can I be a man of action, a man of principle, and deal with all these passions and emotions that are surrounding me when everything is centered on the self, when everything is in doubt, everything's confusing, everything's centered on the self. How can I become a man of action? So that's the play I would recommend for this week.
That's a great recommendation, Hamlet. And interestingly, I have kind of another controversial view sometimes, because a lot of the educational establishment thinks that Hamlet should be taught in high school. It's like, oh, they can relate to it. He's a teenager. This is great for teenagers. I think they actually misunderstand the play. I think the play is much deeper. And I think high school students actually most high school students are not ready to understand the depths of Hamlet, right? I think it gets dismissed as kind of a whiny teenager coming of age play. And I think you're right. It's actually much deeper than that. And I actually think it's better to save Hamlet till students are a little older. And I'm speaking for myself. I read it in high school. I don't think I really appreciated it until later. So I think there's other plays that are much more accessible for high school students that you can get a lot out of. But I would actually save Hamlet. I know a lot of people disagree with me, but in any event, we'll go on to our final story of the day, and it's really a sad story and a reminder that violence is really rampant in our world, and is particularly growing against Catholics in the continent of Africa. So Bishop Osario Sitoro Ofonso was murdered, was shot dead in his home and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the city, but in Mozambique, which is an African nation, on the early morning of June the 6th, so just a couple of days ago. The authorities in the country called it an invasion. His home was attacked with assailants, sort of like a military assault, kind of scaling walls, AK assault rifles. He was shot and found in the hallway of his Episcopal residence. And it's really a reminder. I think we in the United States, we can sort of forget that this animosity, this hostility, this contramundo is really present in many parts of the world. And this bishop who is basically attacked for his status. This has been ongoing months before his death. He had warned repeatedly about escalating violence in this part of Mozambique, particularly where he is, where Islamic insurgent attacks have caused widespread destruction and violent attacks. What's interesting about this is a lot of people said, well, you and said to me and others, well, you're critical of the war in Iran and you're Islamic favoring and you're, Israel's attacking them. And it's really a false dichotomy that's being set up, right? That we either support Israel or we're in favor of Islam, right? And I think the Catholic Church is against both, right? Both are errors, Zionism and this sort of radical Islamicism. The Church has really always considered them both, has been against both of them. If you want to talk about the Jewish point, go watch Tim Flanders' excellent interview on this question. And to just sort of say, well, you've got to support this enemy of the Church because they're a counterweight to this violent Islam, and see what happens in Mozambique is really setting up this false dichotomy. They're both wrong. They're both enemies of the Church, against the teaching of the Church, and Islam is a religion of violence. That is true, right? They want to use that to get a lot of Americans and Christians to support the state of Israel, but it is a true fact. It is that the use of violence is a sanctioned and encouraged method of conversion in the Quran, in their unholy text. And this example of this is yet another reminder of that. It is not a religion of peace, as Francis, John Paul II, Leo would probably want us to believe. Now, does that mean every Muslim takes the Quran seriously? No, right? There are many Muslims who reject that, but they're actually not being true to the logical conclusions of their sacred unholy texts or the teaching of their religion. But violence has been from the beginning an instrument of Islam. And it's sort of ironic. The Church, we're against proselytism, as Pope Francis said, and John Paul II apologized profusely in the 1990s for methods of conversion. And the Church has always been against violent forced conversion. The problem with Vatican II is instead of being against violence to forced conversion, it's basically said telling people the truth is equivalent to what these Islamic sects are doing, going in and killing a bishop, which is, again, a false comparison, right? It is not violence or coercive or against human dignity to present people with the truth, to say, if you don't convert, you're at risk of going to hell. And that is not equivalent to scaling the walls of an Episcopal palace with AK assault rifles and killing a successor of the apostles. But really a harrowing story. What's your comments on this Saturday?
Yeah, we covered this on the Pelican Brief Daily recently, and the thing I would point out is that ISIS does have a growing a presence there in Mozambique that is definitely going to be something to look into here, because this was not, as some of the media outlets have put it, as if he was murdered in the night as a noir case or something. It was not like that. This was an organized effort to try to kill this prince of the church. He was also recently appointed by Leo the 14th, and I think as time goes on, I think we're going to see the importance of this appointment here in Africa, especially because Africa is a very important part of the church at the moment. So I would be on the lookout to see if this was indeed Islamic terrorism. It could have been a case of something more of like a disagreement or something, but that's not what I would turn to first. Last thing I'll say is Islam is a minority religion in Mozambique. It's only around 19% of the people there, and yet you still have violent attacks. It's still a problematic thing in the region. It should be a lesson, I think, for the Western countries that are importing millions upon millions of Islamic migrants each year. A small percentage like that can be a problem in the future. I completely agree with your statements. This is not a dichotomy we need to get in. We need to have of saying you're either for Israel or you're absolutely for Islam. No, it's more nuanced than that. Of course, this is something where it's disappointing. That's become the narrative in modern ideas about Israel and modern talking points about Israel. So I completely agree with you there.
Well, there you have our view of these various stories from the church and the world. We hope you're enjoying this content on Pelican Brief and the Pelican Plus app. Please do focus on the ebooks. I'm just finishing up a book from Oshusty Press by Joseph Bevan called Traddy Daddy. It's a really interesting book. I'm going to try to have them on my show soon to talk about their experiences. And again, for the monthly subscription price, you're not only getting shows and access to these videos, but don't forget a whole library of and audio books that you might have to buy on Kindle if you want an electronic version, or on Audible for $15 or $20. For the price of a subscription, you get all of these books included with your membership at Pelican Plus. So go, if you haven't found them, go to the forum right now in the app. We're going to maybe do some updates soon, but in the forum, and go to ebooks, and you'll just see an incredible number of books. I'm working my way through them. I won't have to buy a book for a while as a result of that. So please check out all the resources on the app. Thank you for your support, and don't forget to join us in consecrating Pelican Plus to the Sacred Heart.
Yeah, and thank you all to our Fleet and Holy League members as well, who help keep this great work that we're doing here at Pelican Plus going. If you're interested in learning more about that and how you can help Pelican Plus even more, if you're a Pelican Plus subscriber, go over to pelicanplus.network, which is where you can learn about the Fleet and the Holy League, the benefits associated with that. It's great stuff over there. So from all of us here at the Pelican Brief, may God grant you many joyful years.